Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in today's video what I'm going to be doing is Angular in 20 minutes. Angular is another one of these front-end frameworks. Again, essentially the idea behind these is that instead of using server-side templating and having your server render each page one by one, you're moving all your rendering to the client. So essentially you're shipping like an empty HTML page, and then all this JavaScript mounts and creates the page from there once the page loads. And the benefit of this is you're shifting a lot of the rendering work over to the client and off your server. The snappiness of the website is a lot faster because the customer only or the user only has to load the website once. The catch is some SEO and some other things, but that's where sort of like these newer frameworks like Next, Nux, SvelteKit kind of come into play. But today we're going to be doing Angular, so the goal is to get all the sort of the main principles of Angular out of the way. Angular is a much more of a batteries included framework, meaning unlike Vue, Svelte, and React, where it offers you sort of the core stuff and then you use like third-party libraries to kind of build on top of it. Angular provides you with everything. It has its own like routing module, forms module. Everything is kind of built in and built into these modules that you can load as needed. And that kind of gives it a little bit of a learning curve because there's just so much there. But once you learn how everything kind of connects and works, then you can pretty much build anything. Okay, you don't have to necessarily be learning third-party libraries because kind of everything you need is built into Angular. So the first thing you want to do is install the Angular CLI, which here's the command. Okay, so once you've done that, then what we can do is we can use this ng-new command to generate a new project. So I'll run that command. We'll call this my first Angular project. And no, we won't worry bothering with routing. There's enough to deal with just the basics. Plain CSS, keep it simple. That's going to start setting up the project. And then we'll wait for that. Just wait for this photo to pop up as it sets this all up. But essentially, like one thing that makes Angular a little bit different is that in like Vue, Svelte, and React, you have components, and components are the building block of everything. Everything is self-contained components. In Angular, you really have sort of three main units instead of just one. You have components, which are pieces of your UI. So again, they will have your template, like your HTML, and your CSS, and your JavaScript, although in this case it's going to be TypeScript. That bundles the logic of the component. Then you're going to have your modules, which are sort of bundles of components and services in your app. So essentially, you can usually for your simple app you'll only have one module, and that's the module that Angular comes with, and that kind of what wires everything together for a chunk of your app. But as your app gets more complicated, instead of having everything in one module, which means everything's going to load right away, you can actually have multiple modules, and it will lazy load as the modules come into scope, and that allows your app to kind of load better. And then there's services. Services are purely sort of data constructs. So the idea is that instead of having to worry about like passing around state among multiple components and props, what you can do is you can create a service, a separate sort of thing, and then inject that where needed into the components that need that data, and have the sort of the data be tracked separately from the components. You can track the data in the components, you can. So if you want everything encapsulated purely in the component, you can do that. It just then gets it gets messy like it does in other frameworks, where basically you have to worry about like state management. But here you can kind of manage a lot of that data and that retrieval of data in a separate service. You don't have to worry about like passing props across the component tree, or bubbling up data through events. You can do both of those things in Angular. You can pass props, and you can bubble up data through events like in Vue. It's just not necessary because you have this other thing called a service. So now that this is done generating, or at least it was, let me refresh here. Oh, I think I know why, because it's going to be under here under this my first Svelte app. Yep. So let me move that. Let's move that over here. There we go. So this is kind of like how an Angular app looks like. So again, instead of JavaScript, you're really using TypeScript. right from the get-go. It's not like Vue, Svelte, and React, where TypeScript is sort of this option you have. You can do it in JavaScript or you can do it in TypeScript. Angular must be done in TypeScript right out of the gate. You really don't need to worry about 90% of all these configuration files. They're there to configure the linting, to configure TypeScript itself, TypeScript testing, which is using Karma. Again, more advanced stuff to configure Angular itself. But we're good. Really, again, like most of these types of frameworks, all the work you need to do is going to be in the source folder. And then, kind of like there was the index.js or main.js in Svelte, Vue, and Angular, Svelte, Vue, and React, here we have main.ts. And main.ts does the job of mounting the app component. So generally, you can see here, the HTML file is really just a file that loads up one component called app root. And that's all it does. Okay, so essentially your whole app is going to be in this app root component. And this main.ts file, what it does, instead of bootstrapping the component to that div, it bootstraps the module. Okay, so remember I said like modules are sort of like your connectors. They connect all the logic in the app. So let's take a look. Where would I find this app module? Well, really all the components, services, modules will be found here in the app folder. And you see here's the module. So it's always like something.module.ts. And right now I'm getting a lot of like syntax errors, but they're not actually errors. It's just this thing complaining. Okay. And I'm going to do an npm install. Oops, I'm in the wrong folder. cd my first cd up. cd my first Angular app. You can tell I just woke up. And then do an npm install. Let that install stuff. Actually, now I'm looking at it, I think this might be the older. So let me just regenerate this app. So let's get rid of this one. Let's just get rid of this terminal. Get rid of this terminal's fine. And let's just regenerate it. ng new. I just want to make sure because I just updated the Angular project generator. My first Angular app. No routing, CSS. Okay, there it goes. It's generating everything. Cool. So again, everything is going to be in this app folder. And you see this app.module.ts. Okay. And so see what it does. It brings in all these modules from the Angular library. Okay, the browser module is the one that's going to actually like mount your code to the browser. So that's sort of like, you only really see that in your main app module, and then here we're declaring any components that will be used within this module. And this bootstrap property is what says, hey, if this module is bootstrap, which is only the main module, because again, our main.ts bootstraps the app module. If you bootstrap that module, which component should be injected onto the screen? App component, which again, this is what we see in the index.html, the app root component. So again, it's the app module that gets bootstrapped to the HTML file. It picks up on the app root component. It then renders it to the screen, and then again, everything else is built inside this app component. And every component in TypeScript is broken down into 4 pieces. So you notice all this app. So you have the app.component.css. This is the CSS for that component. The HTML for that component. So this would be where you write all the HTML. The app component.spec. This is the testing file. And then you have the TypeScript file. This is where you would write all your component logic. So let's run this. We would type in ng-serve, because again, we're using the Angular CLI. ng-serve. Oh, I need to actually cd into the folder. My first Angular app. Okay, and then we're going to do ng-serve. Yeah, sure, why not? Take my data. Okay, and that's going to end up opening our app in the browser. Okay, so it's doing the thing. Okay, that's done. And again, that's going to be opening up the project in right here, localhost 4200. So I open up localhost 4200. And there we go. Okay, so that's like your basic Angular page. That's all coming from these app files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to empty out the app component. So I'm literally just going to delete everything. Okay. Beep. Okay, so again, you can start with nothing. And then I can literally just put like h1 hello world. And this will be fine. Okay, cool. Let me just change this to normal HTML language mode. There we go. So that's fine and well. Okay. So now what happens though, again, this is like different than React, Vue, and Angular, which oftentimes you do most of the things in one file. Here, everything again is broken up into multiple files. So again, if I were to create like in this class for that component, I could define any properties that I want. So if I wanted to define like a variable called cheese that equals Gouda, I would define it here in the class, and then I could do something like h2, and then h2 is double curly bracket, kind of like Vue, and I inject cheese there. And see, I get Gouda over here. So I can inject variables from the class that belongs to the component into the template of the component. So again, from the TS file to the HTML file. Same thing with defining functions I want to use, etc. And I could actually make more components. So I'm going to shut off the server for a second. So what I can do is I can do ng generate component and then create another component called counter. And then there we go. Okay, so now see a folder gets created for that component, and that component gets automatically registered with my app module. So I don't have to worry about maintaining the app module if I take advantage of the CLI. So again, if you use the Angular tools, even though this looks like a crazy setup, it's manageable. Okay, so then the next thing I'd like to do is start creating the counter component. So let me just go do ng-serve again to serve the stuff. And then we go to the counter HTML. So again, it just has counter works. Here's like the class for the counter component. It's all pretty much set up for me. I just have to start like building it. So before I actually start building anything, let's just see if we can see it working. So I'm going to go to the template for the app component and just inject the counter component. I can see with the HTML tag for the counter component right here. That's the HTML tag that I have to use for the counter component. So then here I would use app counter, and then there's my component. And see, we can see counter works. And again, I can use it multiple times if I want, all sorts of cool stuff. Now I can then start declaring properties on here. Like let's say we just say counter equals 0. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to define a method to modify the counter. So we'll just say add 1. So again, this is a class, so you just use class syntax. So in this case, it would just be this.counter plus equals 1. Okay, simple as that. So I have my add 1 method. I have my counter. So literally any property on your class is essentially state. And now I can go inject this, go back to the HTML for the counter. And I can inject like, first let's show the counter. So we'll go here and we'll just do double curly brackets, the counter. And so we see the counter, and then we'll inject the button that says add 1. And then we'll add a event listener, which I'm trying to remember exactly on. I think would be like ng on. No, actually, no. It's going to be more like, I think it's like click. So generally, the way this should work is that whenever you see parentheses, that means the HTML template will send messages to the class. So essentially, when you click this thing is going to send a message over to the class that this function got ran. So I would just say, hey, whenever this happens, I want you to run the command add one, invoke that function. Cool. And let's see here, app component. Actually, let's try that out. So I should be able to click this add one and see it's adding one to the counter. So I can, parentheses always means one direction. So from HTML to TypeScript. Now I could also go the other way around. I could sit there and say, let's say I wanted to bind the class property, so I would put it in squares or square brackets. That means it's going to pull from the TypeScript, so from TypeScript to the HTML. So if I said, cheese, okay, I can go back to the counter component. I didn't like that. Well, I think it's because cheese does not exist yet. So let's make cheese exist on the counter component. So if I were to add cheese equals Gouda, now what's going to happen is that we don't see it, but this item, so let me just show that in DevTools, we should be able to see that it has Gouda as its class. Okay, and see the class equals Gouda, not cheese, even though it says cheese in the template. Okay, and then you also have like directives for like looping and conditional. Like a lot of it's done in the template through these like different directives and special syntax. In the template, you use it to bind it to the component TypeScript file. Okay, and let me just show you a service real quick. So we'll just say ng generate service, we'll just call it data. Okay, unhandled exceptions, server not found. Oh, I wrote server. Generate service. ng generate service. So now it creates a service, and see now here I have data.service, which is just the testing file, and then data.service ts, which is the actual. And essentially what I can do is I can add any data. I can make API calls here, make this the source of data for my components. So let's just pretend that this thing has an array of data. So we'll just call it R equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So that's that. And then the way I would use this thing is use what's called dependency injection. This is not an Angular thing, it's a programming thing. You can see this in a lot of frameworks, but essentially the way is you pull in other things through the constructor of the class. So I would go head over to the counter class. I'd have to import the service, so I'd import data service. Okay, import data service, and then in the class constructor, what I would do is I would say there is a argument called data, and then I would type it as data service. And because I added the type of data service, and again, assuming you're familiar with some TypeScript, it knows that it should inject the data service, an instance of the data service class in here. So then what I can do is I can then declare a property called data, okay, which is going to be of type data service. Okay. And then I can assign it over here and be like this dot data equals data. So I'm assigning that, and now I can then now use it going forward. So I can be like, I can now use it in my HTML. So I can do something like h1 ng4. ng4 is a directive for looping. Okay, this will be the last thing we do. So ng4. Always forget how the ng4 works in this. Okay, but generally it should be like ng4. Documentation can be a little intimidating. Okay, so ng4. Just see a simple one. Here we go. So it's asterisk ng4. And then we would just say like let num of R, because R is the array. Oh no, actually the array is data. Dot technically R, because technically data is the object, the data service, and then that data service had a property called R. So let num of data R, and I would just say index as I. That'd be the index of the item. Okay, and then I would just leave it at that. I'm not going to bother with the first as first. And then let me just put the closing H1, and then I can put like num here with double curly brackets. Okay, and then I should see the loop, which I don't yet. Oh, because I'm not running the server yet. So let's just run the server and see that, and then we'll wrap this up. But essentially, that's kind of how you would do it. So instead of like mapping over an array, you would use these directives. What is it complaining about here? It doesn't like that. ng4, error occurs in the template component. Okay. Parse error, unexpected token at column in 32. Okay, so let me just take a look at the example, make sure I set it up right. ng4 equals let of data.r. Let me just make sure that data is going to be having a property called R. So let's just do this. Let's get rid of that second exclamation point. I think that's probably what's messing it up. Yep, that's what was messing it up. And there you go. You see we looped over the array. Okay, so you can use these different directives. There's a lot of ways of using them. That's the thing with Angular, is like it gives you a lot, so it can seem very intimidating. But if you focus on just kind of getting those basic pieces that replicate what you could normally do in like React, Svelte, Vue, you can see it gets powerful, and then it gives you a bunch of more features that are really powerful, like pipes and all the little bells and whistles with the forms module, etc. So, but yeah, that's Angular in 20 minutes. I'll see you all later. Have a great day and enjoy.